And today marked the deadline for global trade partners to reach a deal with the U.S. For those who didn't, President Trump signed new levies that go into effect next week. So there's a lot to follow here. And joining us to discuss the latest developments is Javier Palomarez, founder and CEO of U.S. Hispanic Business Council. He's also a former Obama campaign advisor. And also we have Armen Kurdian, a foreign policy and national security analyst. He's a political strategist and running for a California state Senate seat. So for those who missed the deadline, perhaps we can start with President Trump laying out new rates in an executive order ranging from 10 to 41%. So Javier, I'll start with you today. What do you make of the response from global trade partners so far?
Well, obviously the deadlines come, and so here we are. And while some deals continue to flood in, I think people are rushing to the finish line, if you will. I'm particularly focused and happy to see that we've taken a 90-day extension with Mexico. As you know, that's our number one trade partner. Mexico and Canada, number one, number two. These critical trade partners are incredibly important, not only from a trading perspective, but from a national security perspective. And it's obvious that Mexico would be the number one trade partner to states like Texas and California, Arizona, New Mexico, et cetera. But what's not so obvious is that Mexico is also the number one trade partner for states as far-flung as Nebraska and Tennessee and Ohio and Oregon. And so, that's an important player, if you will, in this larger mix. I'm happy to see that. The Canada tariffs remain at 35%. That poses some risk for specific industries, auto manufacturing, for example, and construction. And the rest of the countries, as you said earlier, it ranges from 10% to 40-something percent. I'm hopeful that calmer heads will prevail, that we stay the course. I'm delighted with what I saw earlier this week in the European Union deal, and I'm hopeful that those kinds of deals are about to happen with the remaining partners that we need to negotiate with.
So Armen, Javier mentioned Mexico and Canada. So my question to you is, since the Trump administration has reached deals with the EU and Japan, does that give the president better leverage when it comes to negotiating with other countries like Mexico and Canada and China and other countries?
It does to a certain extent, Don, because once you're first at the table and you get a really good trade deal, then the margin of what's left to continue to trade gets smaller. However, of course, Canada and Mexico are our two largest trading partners. So we obviously need to have, and the transportation is obviously much easier because it doesn't need to go over the water. It goes over land. So these trading deals are going to be very important. Mexico, you've got a lot of automobiles, a lot of clothing, food products on both sides of the border. So we are still a net importer from both of these countries that is going to go through. And how tariffs are leveraged on some of these industries. I'm a bigger fan of looking at tariffs, by industry or by sector necessarily than by global tariffs, which I think can be or sometimes can have a negative impact. But if we can be a lot more judicious and have something more creative, such as what we did with Europe, with the tremendous success that we're going to have with this now energy importation of liquid natural gas and other energy into Europe to break the stranglehold that Russian energy has over Europe, I think is going to be really fantastic for both sides. So that is, as you saw the German official speak, that is definitely a win-win for both sides. When you get to win-win on both sides on trade deals, whether it's steel, whether it's energy, whether it's clothing or other services, that is this kind of deal I think Trump is actually trying to look for.
Okay, Javier, earlier you said you're hopeful about how this might play out. You're cautiously optimistic. So the Treasury just reported a new monthly record tariff revenue at $28 billion. And you know what? American companies or importers are paying that. So what are your thoughts on in terms of this surge in revenue? What does it mean for U.S. companies, consumers, prices, inflation?
The thing with tariffs is, as I've said before, a tariff, it can be a very useful tool. But again, it should be used more like a surgical instrument, not a blunt tool. And so it's really about the deficits that exist, how we negotiate that. To Armand's point, there are some things that get tariffed, and we feel differently about them. Computer chips versus blue jeans. There are things that we critically need for the advancement, the continued well-being of the American economy, the American people. And so those are the tariffs that we're most closely watching. Certainly, tariffs used with our number one, number two trade partners, Mexico and Canada, are important not only because of the points that Armand made, but beyond that, they help us wean away from China. And what we need to do is stay laser focused on the fact that we must break the dependence that exists with China right now. These tariffs can help in that regard. If you look at the EU deal, I'm hopeful that that is a bellwether for what happens next. The EU deal was fantastic in that it finally reversed what was an untenable situation for our automobile manufacturers. Remember, prior to Monday, an American automaker tried to sell into any one of those 27 European countries, and they were facing a 10% tax on that product. Conversely, Mercedes, BMW, Volvo, and all those other makers in the European nation that sold to us, they were only facing a 2% tariff. Now it's the inverse of that. Now we've equalized that situation. We finally, restored American automobile competitiveness on that global scale. The EU is about a 20% of the global GDP. This was something that was long overdue, and the EU deal finally broke that, and now we're in a more competitive state. I'm hopeful that what we see coming forward in all the other deals is structured somewhere around what we did with the EU deal. I think that was a phenomenal deal. It was great for the automobile manufacturers in America, and it was time that we were on a level playing field with those 27 nations across the ocean.
So Armen, as you and Javier have both said, there's a lot of good things that have come from these tariffs. But tangibly speaking, Armen, how do we measure success here?
Certainly, tariffs are only one part of the equation. To Javier's point, you don't want to put a large tariff on, say, semiconductors or, say, flat panel displays, considering we don't make them in this country. But it's only one part of the larger picture. I think the biggest thing that we can see, and there's been a lot of complaints or concerns that tariffs are going to slow down the economy, raise prices. The biggest thing that Donald Trump during his first administration and can do now, frankly, is deregulation. The cost of regulation under his first term was actually dropped by about $370 billion, while some estimates in the last administration, under the Biden administration, was between $1.5 and $2 trillion of additional regulation costs that were imposed on American businesses. However you do it, if you just can reduce the cost of doing business in the United States, whether it's regulation, whether it's insurance, whether it's facilities, whether it's permitting, whether it's taxes, what have you, that will necessarily drive up employment and make it easier to actually start a business and work and do that kind of work in this country. That, frankly, has been one of the largest drags on our economy that we've had for over the last couple of decades, is the unelected state of good ideas, of regulations that are placed in without really understanding what the secondary consequences of those are, because every time you put in a regulation, it has an impact on everything else around it. Things that are done that sound great, but really haven't put like a risk management stamp on it. Say this is something we're going to be more tighter on environmental, but really, what is the actual health benefit of actually doing it? Certainly, we don't want to live in an unhealthy society, but lately, a lot of these regulations have simply gone out of control, and bringing that into more reasonable, more common sense regions is going to be a stimulator for the economy.
Okay, Javier, have these tariffs impacted the U.S.'s relationships with trading partners? Let's say the U.S.'s relationship with the country was at 100%. Are we now at 90% or 85%?
Well, no doubt, these are tough negotiations. No doubt Donald Trump has approached it with a zeal that we've never seen before. And no doubt that our trading partners are a little bit bruised. I completely understand that. But at the end of the day, he ran on a mandate, and this is part of that mandate. Armand made a critical point here. These tariffs are just one of the tools in a very large toolbox, if you will, that this administration has to work with. And so while, this may be a strain on some of the relationships we have with some of our friends throughout the globe. The reality of it is, we are, as a business community, delighted to see a president that is looking at it from a different perspective, that is willing to take, the tough road, make the tough negotiation. Again, if the EU deal is an indication of what comes next, the net is good for the American people, good for the American economy. But to your question, no question, Don, that there will be some bruised feelings here, and how we implement, how we behave ourselves on a going forward basis. There will have to be a lot of diplomacy, but I think that these things can be worked around, and I'm hopeful that our trading partners will see our point of view as well. As I mentioned, when you look at the automobile manufacturing sector in America, for the longest time we've been hamstrung now, and finally we're in a competitive posture. So surely our trade partners throughout the 27 nations that make up the EU, that I'm sure they see that we had something that we needed to make our industries more competitive and to allow us to be on better footing on a global basis.
Okay, Armen, Javier used the words "no doubt." Same question to you. Is it putting a strain on partners and allies of the U.S.?
Early on, I think it may have, when he did his global tariffs on everybody. We saw what happened in the markets. He quickly stood back from that. I think he's kind of learned you have to be a little bit more thoughtful and basically accommodating and working with your partners across the way for some of these tariffs. So I think it's improved somewhat. I do believe that, in a large part, a lot of countries have gotten away with unfair trade practices against the U.S. China, especially. Just look at rare earth metals processing, and with that, they so undervalue the work that they actually do that it's unprofitable and almost impossible to do that kind of work in the United States. So, of course, there's a national security aspect of that as well, and that's also connected to the rest of the trade policy that we have with China. China has been a very unfair trade partner with us, and as part of their larger strategy to be a geopolitical, global powerhouse and to be able to military influence the events that are in their region of the world, in the Indo-PACOM region. So, as you can see, this is a bit of systems engineering where everything has an impact on everything else around it. But if we can, as I said before, come to some kind of reasonable accommodation or reasonable trade agreement with nations, with EU, or in a country on a case-by-case basis, I think it will very much improve things. It can't be unfair in one way, in one direction or another, because in the long run, it doesn't benefit either nation.
Yeah, you're definitely right on that. Anything when it comes to the economy is a balancing act. If there's a pro, there's going to be a con, and it's really about, if the pros outweigh the cons at the end of the day. Yeah, so I think we can leave the conversation there. Thank you both, Armen, Javier. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
It's done.